This recording is produced by the Sandwich Guildhall Museum. Hello everyone! We are the Sandwich Guildhall Museum. My name is Gia and I am a volunteer digital content assistant who works with Millie, the museum manager. As a team, Millie and I wanted to commemorate our town's history and do something special for the 80th anniversary of VE Day. So here you are, listening to our one-off recording where we will dive deep into a very special piece of local history, talking to an expert guest to educate you all on everything to do with the Kitchener camp. Before we get into the interview, I first wanted to briefly speak about why this year is a special year, worthy of this special recording. The 8th of May 2025 marks the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II for the Allies and the Axis, a day that is celebrated and remembered as VE Day. Although we are marking this occasion now, we should acknowledge that VE Day, which is Victory in Europe Day, was not the end of the war for the entire world. Conflict was still occurring in the Asia-Pacific region. The surrender documents from Japan were signed on the 2nd September 1945, finalising the official end of the Second World War. 15th of August is remembered as VJ Day. To highlight VE Day, we at the Sandwich Guildhall Museum have decided to focus our attention on remembering our local history of the Kitchener camp by talking to an expert who knows all about it. Stemming from her own personal connections to the camp, our guest today has dedicated the past several years to collecting and preserving the history of the seemingly forgotten about Kitchener camp. With this, she has created a digital archive, a website titled the Kitchener Camp Project, which you can still visit. I would like to introduce everyone to Dr. Clare Weissenberg.
Hi, lovely to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Thank you so much for joining us. Claire, in your own words, could you explain to the listeners just a brief introduction to the Kitchener camp for those who don't know?
So, the persecution of German Jews began in 1933 when Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Anti-Semitic legislation started immediately, and over the next few years, approximately 400 pieces of such legislation were passed. Dachau concentration camp, the first of the concentration camps, opened approximately 2 months after Hitler became Chancellor. The first key date in all this for the Kitchener history is November 1938, and most people will know this as Kristallnacht, so-called. That's the Nazi term. It's not one I'm particularly comfortable with. I tend to refer to the events of November 38. And during November 38, again, most people have probably seen photographs of broken shop windows, of burning synagogues. What many people don't know is around the same time, within a few days of this violence against properties, against homes, against shops, against cemeteries, against synagogues, there was also a roundup of German Jewish men. Approximately 30,000 German Jewish men were arrested in November 38 and sent mainly to one of 3 concentration camps, Dachau, Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen. Now, German Jews had been trying to leave Germany over the 1930s. The Nazi Party at this stage wanted them to leave. Most countries didn't want to accept more immigrants. There'd been a conference called the Evian Conference in 1938, where country after country had gone, no, we're not increasing our quotas. So the Nazi government wanted German Jews to leave, and German Jews wanted to leave, but for most there was nowhere to go. So we get to November 38. 30,000 were arrested and imprisoned in concentration camps. And finally, this changes international response to what was going on in Nazi Germany. And particularly in Britain, there was an additional push for this urgent need to rescue Jews from Greater Germany, Austria, Sudetenland. A British Jewish aid agency called the Central British Fund for German Jews, it's now World Jewish Relief, managed to get the British government to agree to some group rescues of German Jews. Now, one of them, everyone listening will have heard of. It's the Kindertransport rescue of around 10,000 unaccompanied. They weren't allowed to come out with their parents. About 7,500 of them were Jewish. Another group rescue was of about 15,000 German Jewish women on what were known as domestic service visas. And the third of the biggest of the group rescues was the rescue at Kitchener Camp. So of the 30,000 German Jewish men who'd been arrested and imprisoned, there were initially set up to be 3,000 places in this Kitchener Camp rescue. In fact, we think about 4,000 came out that way in the end. The British Jewish Aid Agency that had persuaded the British government to set up these group rescues had to provide the finance, they had to make the travel arrangements, and they had to undertake that the refugees would move on to another country. They weren't supposed to stay. The 4,000 who finally got a place at Kitchener between February 39 and September 39 all had to show that they could move on to another country. Mostly they had visas for the United States. Kitchener Camp in Sandwich was chosen by 3 architects who knew about this dilapidated World War I camp just outside Sandwich down the Ramsgate Road. It was in a bad state of repair, but 2 British architects, Stephen and Ernest Joseph, and a German Jewish refugee architect, well, Austrian originally, called Walter Marek. And they went round the camp and they went, yeah, we can do something with this. We can bring in refugees who can renovate the camp. And that was the start of it. The initial refugees brought out were tradesmen, craftsmen, carpenters, builders, bricklayers, etc. Some were from German Jewish training schools where they'd been learning the skills that enabled them to help rebuild the camp. Yeah, it went from there. So the camp was renovated and approximately 4,000 German Jews were rescued, mostly from these concentration camps.
Thank you so much. That was such a great explanation, including the historical context of what was happening around the world that led to the refurbishment and use of the Kitchener camp. Not only did the refugees work to maintain the camp, we know that they also experienced leisure activities. These included visiting the local town of Sandwich, as well as towns around, such as Ramsgate. There were lots of trips to the cinema, and a lot of the refugees had their own sports game events. We also know that the Kitchener camp had their own orchestra, and they hosted orchestra recitals in Sandwich. These recitals and concerts used to gain such large crowds and were so popular that the BBC had even made arrangements to record an orchestra recital of the Kitchener camp. Unfortunately, this was cancelled as the recording was set to happen on the 2nd of September. And due to, and this is a quote, in view of the present and unsettled situation, BBC had to pull out. From the perspective of us as a museum, was, of course, we understand why the war was just about to break out a few days later. It is unfortunate. It would have been so nice to have listened to a recording of the Kitchener Camp Orchestra today. Also for my research, I came across this lovely line from a YouTube video made from Learning from the Righteous, where the narrator, Louisa Klein, she talks about how in addition to the physical refuge, the Kitchener camp also provided these Jewish men, and these are in her words, a level of autonomy and trust that enabled these broken men the space to regain some equilibrium. I just thought that quote was beautiful. That they were a space where these horrifically traumatized men could be safe, physically and mentally, and allow themselves to learn how to rebuild trust with people around them, with people who will not persecute them just for their religion or race. The sudden change in their lives coming from Nazi Germany to this whole new country with a completely different language and being accepted by the local town, that change would have been terrifying. But the Kitchener camp allowed the space to settle, and it's because of this that the camps were so important. And it's because of this that I am so glad that we are still talking about them 80 years on. I wanted to turn the focus now onto yourself, Claire, and this research and work that you've done with the Kitchener Camp project. Would you mind, for our listeners, to explain what this incredible website, the Kitchener Camp project, is?
Possibly easiest to describe it through how it began. I was doing some volunteer work, training at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London to use the International Tracing Service database as it was then. It's now been very much updated and it's something you can now search for yourself online. But at the time, you had to put in an application to find out about what records they might have on family that was lost in the Holocaust. So I was training to use this database to be able to help families find their information. At the same time, I was getting my father's documents and letters translated from German into English and was putting together a website, just sort of a small website for my family to see what we were finding out. It's called From Numbers to Names. And I was working through my dad's letters and documents chronologically and came across references to Kitchener Camp, that there were only a small handful of documents with this name on. And I thought, what was that? So the woman I was training with at the Wiener Holocaust Library, I was sitting next to her one day and I said, by the way, what's Kitchener Camp? What was that about? Do you know anything about it? And she said, I don't know a lot about it, but a woman who lives in Sandwich, who I'm sure you know about, Clare Weissenberg, who wrote a marvellous book on the Kitchener Camp rescue called 4,000 Lives. She had not long since published this book, and she said she loves to hear from Kitchener families. Here's her email address, get in touch. So that was one thread of where my interest in this started. Another thread was I was trying to find any information I could about what Kitchener Camp was. And this was about 2016, I think. There wasn't much online. You could Google it at the time and really get no information. And one of the places I looked was the Journal of the Association of Jewish Refugees, which is published monthly, and it has been going since the early 1940s. So I was doing a sort of search in the journal, and I came across an advert that had been put there by a chap called Stephen Nelkin, and I know you're going to be talking about his father's Kitchener diaries a bit later. And the advert said, is anyone else out there with a connection to a Jewish university fraternity from Breslau University, and it was called the Cartel Convent. Now, while I'd been looking through my dad's paperwork, I'd seen reference to the Cartel Convent, and I had various bits and pieces from his fraternity uniform and etc., etc. So I got in touch with Stephen and said, yes, my dad was in the Cartel Convent fraternity and at Breslau. And Stephen's dad had been in the Cartel Convent at Breslau. And then it turned out, as we got chatting, they'd both been in Kitchener Camp. So Stephen and myself and Clare Weissenberg, the Kitchener author, all got in touch together and said, look, why don't we see if there's anyone else around with some of these connections? And we organised, or Stephen and Clare organised, a lunch at the Bell Hotel in Sandwich, which features quite a lot in Kitchener histories, as you know. So about 60 of us turned up. It was extraordinary. 60 people that had never met before. And it was just this sort of wall of sound. Everybody had questions. Everybody wanted to know more. And particularly know more about their own father's or grandfather's experiences, because that's the bit we didn't have. We maybe all had a photograph, one, we maybe all had a letter or two or a document or two, but nobody really had a sense of the bigger history. So I guess because I was doing the From Numbers to Names website, where I was looking at letters, documents, and photographs, those became the headings for the new Kitchener website that I put together. Yes, I set out really because I had so many questions, and I could tell that there were lots of other people with questions. I knew there must be, the better part of 4,000 families with lots of questions. So the idea was to rebuild this forgotten Kitchener history, one letter, one document, and one photograph at a time, by pulling all that material together to rebuild the wider history, as I say, I contacted as many of the Holocaust institutions as I could, where I could see that they had holdings on Kitchener. And again, just trying to bring as much as possible into one space. I assumed when I started the Kitchener project that most of my time would be spent in archives. Actually, the response from families was so overwhelming from across the globe that I never really got time to get into archives, and that's still something I very much want to do. I know there's a lot more material out there to be found. People periodically send me links, and it is something, it feels unfinished. It's something I still want to get to.
I think that also highlights a key point. Years in the making, and yet your work on this is unfinished still. And it shows that's just how big, how huge of a grand scheme this was, and how many people have been affected by the Kitchener camp. And yet, despite how many people are affected by it, people don't know about it. And as you said, when you were first looking into it, there was hardly any mentions of it. What I think you've done, the story you've just said there of 60 people at the Bell Hotel in Sandwich just coming together. These are probably people thinking, oh, I'll show up. My family's related, has a story here. Maybe I'll be one of 5 people to show up. And then 60 people. I know, I've been in the Bell Hotel. I know you must have filled up the whole area there. But that's incredible. I wonder, in that moment, did you feel a sense of, wow, what I'm doing right now, what I'm about to do, this is important. This needs to be spoken about, simply from how many people have showed up. Did you feel a sense of, it's on me now to share the story?
Never felt it quite in that way. I've always wanted this. I suppose I recognized a need to know in the room. And it just seemed like an obvious way to find out more because it was something I was doing anyway, creating a website to share information. I've never felt it was about sort of me and mine in that sense. I've always wanted it to be about the families generally. I'm much more interested in the individual refugees than I am in the administration of the camp, which I think Clare Anderson covered brilliantly. And she also looked at individual refugee histories. But my interest is definitely in the sort of minutiae, the detail of the men, of the refugees, of the individuals. And alongside that, because they're, as far as I know, all dead at this point, I don't think we've got any living Kitchener refugees left. One very, very elderly gentleman died towards the end of the time I was working on the project, which finished in 2019. I got an email from a chap who'd been caring for him in the States to say something about it, but I'm not aware of anyone else still being alive. So the history's very definitely gone to the families. And there was a section on the Kitchener website that I headed Memories. And when I put that on the website, I assumed that what I encouraged people to put on there was something their father or grandfather might have said about Kitchener, as near as we could get to some kind of direct narrative about it. In fact, that became somewhere that was a kind of repository for a family's sense of what it meant and wider family histories. And the reason for that is that Kitchener refugees didn't really talk about this at all. Most of them. There were 1 or 2 notable exceptions. And in fact, Stephen's dad, Lothar Nelken, was one of those exceptions. He did talk about his experiences. The vast majority didn't. So what we have as descendants and what became very much an integral part of the Kitchener project is a kind of, we all have a family mythology about it, what little we were told. Most people have a narrative, something like, my father was on the last train out. Now, if they'd all been on that last train out, that train would have had people hanging from the ceilings. Yeah, I had that narrative on the one train out, and my dad came out in June. It was nowhere near the last train out. Most people thought there was a secrecy about it, that they left in secret. They didn't. Information about Kitchener camp was in German Jewish newspapers on the front page. This is a way out.
It was all over the press here, as you probably know.
Yeah.
Not just in local newspapers, but nationally, information about Kitchener Camp was frequently put out. What we have is a sort of mixture of what the family mythologies were and a kind of a sense of progressing from mythology to what the facts were. And I think people found that quite healing, if that makes sense, quite a healthy thing. People found out all sorts of things that made sense of their own lives and their own experiences. Just knowledge is always better than secrecy. My dad believed above all else in education. And when people would periodically ask me during the project, what do you think your dad would have thought of this? I can't possibly guess what my dad would have thought of this. He died long before people talked about the Holocaust much, before survivors talked about the Holocaust much. It wasn't a thing in his lifetime. So I can't possibly pretend to know that. But I do know he believed in education, that he believed his education saved his life. I hope that the knowledge we've gained as a group of families and beyond the families to the wider communities, I hope that knowledge stands for something bigger than the history itself.
Wow. Very well said. I think it does. I really do. You created this Leave to Land exhibition, which is a travelling exhibition, now owned by the Vienna Holocaust Library. Sandwich Guildhall Museum, in fact, hosted this exhibition just last year in 2024. As an announcement to everyone listening, we currently have a version of this exhibition in our courtroom right now. I highly recommend everyone listening definitely see this in person. It's available now, closing soon. Make sure you check the museum website for specific dates. About this exhibition as well, you said when discussing the importance of your research and how knowledge is important and how your dad believed in knowledge and education, you talked about how, to you, the important part of history was the individual story. And you mentioned, I want to get the pronunciation right, is it Lothar Nelken?
Lothar, I think.
Lothar Nelken, the father of Stephen Nelken, member of the team for Kitchener Camp Project. You mentioned how he was one of the few refugees that openly spoke about his experience. Now, for the listeners at home, when I was doing research for this, I, of course, read the Kitchener Camp Project website. I wanted to quickly share some of my favourite moments. This is all available to access on the Kitchener Camp Project website. So he speaks about, in this one particular entry, his first time enjoying an English beer in an English pub. He says he goes into Sandwich, as a lot of Jewish refugee men used to do, go into the local town. And this is a quote, according to him, the English beer, it costs a small fortune and tastes different from German beer, but good. And I thought it's funny. It's a little humorous mention of, yeah, the beer here is expensive and it's not like my beer that I'm used to, but it's good, I guess. It'll do. And to put this in context, this is a really, as we know, really dark time in history. And what he's going through, this complete move to be safe. And suddenly, despite it being really dark, there are these moments of lights and positivity and a funny comment about how British beer is not the same as German beer. What follows on in this same extract is then he then talks about how him and the men from the camp that he was with had bought their drinks, and before they even sat at the table, a local Sandwich resident had bought them all another round of drinks. I loved this. To me, it showed the welcoming and friendly nature of the residents. The population of the Kitchener camp doubled the population of Sandwich. So this was a huge change to the town, and it was lovely reading in his diary extract that the town locals, us, Sandwich, we were happy. I have to mention, because as a museum, it is important that we do mention that this was a very positive aspect from the diary entries. We are aware that this is not the opinion of everyone in town. This account is positive, but it would be inappropriate of us to ignore that anti-Semitism was still rife in our society. Within the population of Sandwich, we do know there were definitely individuals who were very much against these Jewish refugees. And whilst it is important we share the great news and the great stories of the Kitchener camp, we must highlight it wasn't always great for everyone here. And back to the local stories and individual stories, I want to ask Claire if you had your own favourite story that you discovered through this project, or whether there was a certain anecdote that really stuck with you.
I was having a think about this, obviously. It's difficult to highlight something that's a sort of a favourite story in that sense. All the histories were fascinating in that every history I heard about or read about added something to the larger history of the rescue. I suppose that the thing that interested me most were the intersections of those histories. So where one or two or more histories collided, where somebody would send me a name and I'd know the name because it was in another refugee's letter. So an example, a personal example for me would be there was a letter from my grandmother who was killed in the Holocaust at Auschwitz. There's a letter from my grandmother to my father saying, "Oh, this young lad, Felix Bujakowski, is coming to Kitchener camp. His parents want you to look after him while he's there. It would mean a lot to them. Obviously, if he gets sent somewhere else, you won't be able to help. But if he ends up at Kitchener, help him out. Make sure he's okay." And a few weeks into starting this project, I got an email from what turned out to be, he didn't know, and I didn't know when we started, turned out to be the grandson of Felix Bujakowski. So here I was, having read this reference in my grandmother's letter, the grandmother I never got the chance to meet. And here's his grandfather sending me photographs and information. And he was one of the, what was known as the Berlin Ort Boys. It was a German Jewish training school of youngsters, much younger than were usually in the camp. And 100 of them were being sent up to Leeds to continue their training at a school there. And the school wasn't finished and ready for them yet. So they were sent to Kitchener for about 6 weeks, and Felix was one of these. So and there were all kinds of moments like that where it was just kind of, oh my goodness, 80 years on, we're meeting either on email or in person these people whose lives intersected, and that was fascinating to me. In terms of an individual story, I think the one that probably has stayed with me most vividly was the Brill family. Kitchener refugee Walter Brill was brought over in the first tranche of refugees to renovate the camp. He was a master carpenter. He gave an interview before he died about his wartime experiences generally and some information about Kitchener camp. And very poignantly in that interview, he was saying that we had to work very long and hard in difficult conditions, basically. But for every hut we finished, we knew that 72 more men could be rescued from a concentration camp. So that was Walter Brill, working hard in very hard conditions over that winter of 38 to 39, or starting in February 39, but was doing it to literally rescue people from concentration camps. And by summer 39, his wife, Irmgard Brill, who was very pregnant at the time, was also flown out, which was unusual, by the Central British Fund. And she landed in London about 2 weeks before she had a baby. And that baby got in touch with me as an 80-odd-year-old man, knowing really nothing about his own history, to the extent that I was able to show him a photograph of himself as a baby that's on the back of a Kitchener camp magazine called Some Victims of the Nazi Terror. He'd never seen that photo before. Himself as a baby with his two parents. It was taken at Kitchener camp. But what was most extraordinary was that baby's name was Winston Jonas Brill. Now, after the war, his parents, they had 4 sons by this stage. Walter had joined the Pioneer Corps fought with the for the British Army. After the war, they were moving on to the States, as they'd always meant to do. Little Winston grows up in the States, he becomes a professor, he has his own children, he has grandchildren, etc., gets to 80 something, has no idea why he's called Winston Jonas Brill, or that there's any significance to that name. Of course, Winston was the Prime Minister. Jonas was the director of Kitchener Camp. Can you imagine getting to 80 something before you understand the origins of your name? That's the extent to which these men didn't talk about their experiences as refugees. And I think that history, for me, just signifies so much of what there was for every family to find out from the records once we knew where to look.
That's amazing. You managed to complete blanks in this man's family history that he didn't even know about. To be able to explain to him, you were called this because... That's incredible. Thank you for sharing that. Really, thank you. We've spoken about how this project has closed. I was wondering, can people still get in touch somehow? Is there a way that if people wanted to share any history, if they have any relation to Kitchen Camp, where do they go to?
I have handed over the website to the Vienna Holocaust Library, but I do still periodically get people getting in touch, families getting in touch saying, this, I've just heard about it, can we add the materials? The answer is yes, I can add the materials still. The Vienna Library has been very generous and given me access to be able to do that. If anyone, there is a section on the website for Sandwich, specifically for Sandwich residents. It's titled Sandwich Family Memories on the blog. We didn't get very much information from Sandwich residents, and I would still love to hear anything, photographs. Quite a number of the refugees stayed in touch with Sandwich families after the war, even because residents had the refugees into their homes, they'd taken them out for drives, they'd taken, had them in for afternoon tea, all sorts of things. And those relationships in a number of cases continued to well after the war. So if there's any, as I say, photographs, letters, documents, or verbal memories, I would be absolutely fascinated to hear, good or bad. Finding or looking into exploring a history means exploring the nuts and bolts of the good and the bad. So the whole picture is what I'm interested in. If somebody has some information, some materials that they want to share with the project, then they can email me. The original email address was closed down when I passed over the website, but created a Gmail address that's easy enough. It's kitchenerhistory@gmail.com. kitchenerhistory@gmail.com. So if anyone listening has got, as I say, photographs, wonderful, letters, documents of any kind, the guys who ran Kitchener Camp, the two May brothers, Jonas that I've mentioned and his brother Phineas May is the surname, they, to help get past what might have been negative feelings about 4,000 foreign men coming to live just half a mile up the road from Sandwich, they ordered most things locally. So coal was ordered locally, a lot of the food stuff was ordered locally. So there's a lot of business going on. So if you've got a small business that, your granddad or your dad ran or something, there may well be some information in there, receipts or invoices. You never know. I know it's a long time on, but some of us keep all sorts of things for an unreasonable length of time. So it's always worth asking the question. Nothing with reference to this is too small.
That's brilliant. It's, again, those receipts that you've piled up and your mother and your grandfather has piled up the back of the drawer somewhere, they can still be useful. That's what we want to say. Yeah, so thank you so much. We will leave a link for your email, as you mentioned there, and the link for Sandwich residents to access that's on the Kitchener Camp project, so we can submit any information, as you say, good or bad. Before we end this interview, I wanted to ask yourself, Claire, what are you currently doing? What's your current or future plans of research? Is there anything that you wanted to promote and share with us, the world, or whoever few people are listening to this?
Well, having had several years of a break, and as I said, feeling the work is unfinished. I mean, it probably will always feel unfinished. I think that's the kind of the research experience generally. But I think in this case, there really is a lot that's unfinished. So I've been starting to have early conversations with various people and institutions about the possibility of a Kitchener Camp project Mark II. I don't want to say too much about part of the project. Part of it is simply to really get into the archival materials and bring those together. So that's the kind of mundane bit. I am giving a couple of papers at an expo at the Landecker Institute, which is part of Sussex University. If anyone might be going to their expo in June, end of June of this year, then I will be giving a talk both on Project Mark I that finished and some of the ideas for Project Mark II, including an exciting new digital endeavour.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. This has been an incredible interview. I will again highlight the links for where, if you are a Sandwich resident in particular, want to share, or even not Sandwich, anyone listening, wherever you are in the world, if you know anything or have any relation, please do get in touch and we will give the links and the email addresses where you need to get in touch to share this information. Thank you so much, Claire. It's been a pleasure talking to you and getting to learn so much more about this almost unspoken about bit of history. Thank you so much, Claire, for everything. I hope you've had an enjoyable time sharing your stories with this.
I have. Thanks so much for asking me on.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you everyone for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this new format, this new way of sharing our local town's history from the Sandwich Guildhall Museum. I've certainly loved doing this. It was so great that I feel like I want to do it again. The Sandwich Guildhall Museum is open Wednesdays to Sundays, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Don't forget to come along and see the Leave the Land exhibition in our courtroom, available until the 18th of May of this year, 2025. For links, if you want to get in touch with us, search for the Sandwich Guildhall Museum on Facebook, Instagram and Blue Sky. If you have information related to the Kitchener Camp, please either contact Claire at her email, kitchenerhistory@gmail.com, or go onto the Kitchener Camp Project website. The link is in the description. If you're wanting to find Claire, as mentioned, she'll be at the Connective Holocaust Commemoration Expo at the University of Sussex on the 24th to 26th of June. Finally, this recording was produced by the Sandwich Guildhall Museum. Dr. Clare Weissenberg has been our incredible guest today, and I, Gia, have been your host, writer, and executive producer. Millie, the museum manager, has also been the executive producer and editor. Thank you to everyone involved, and especially thank you, listeners. I wonder if you'll hear from us again. You can't see me right now, but I'm winking. Goodbye.